Hello, everyone. Bible believers around the world. So this is not the typical Bible lesson. This is more of a story time about what happened to me yesterday and some revelations that I had about it and how this is just something very important to talk about. Now, I do have some Bible lessons in the works, but it might be a few days before they get released. So I had the revelation recently, and this is not something that is new for me, but anger, and I'm not talking about righteous anger, because righteous anger is biblical and okay with the Most High Yahuwah. Like, for example, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai and saw that the Israelites had rejected Yah and started worshiping idols, and he was furious. That's the type of anger that we need. We need to be furious over wickedness. That's what we need. But if it's one thing I've learned, is that this worldly emotional anger is barely useful, all right? Because Satan actually loves to use anger, because worldly anger leads to so many issues, and very often it can easily lead to disobedience to the Most High Yahuwah. So yesterday, I was fishing. I don't usually talk about any of my hobbies on this channel, because this channel is for the Most High Yah and spreading his truth amongst all the nations and, Israelites in these nations as well, Gentiles and Israelites. But I was fishing, one of my hobbies, and it was a good day. I was fishing, the fish were biting, it was really good. And this black truck drives by me. Now, my fishing spot, this pier is near the road, and this truck drives past me, and this Japhethite inside the truck screams the N-word at me while passing. And I was just enraged about the situation. And my anger just grew and grew to the point where I was no longer behaving righteously. I was no longer thinking righteously. And what it made me think about was it's experiences like these that are responsible for the devil doctrines of the One West camps. What I experienced, it was very interesting, because I kind of thought to myself multiple times throughout yesterday, so this is how the Nation of Islam was created. This is how the One West camps were created. Some Israelite somewhere was hurt by a Japhite, and they let this evil anger consume them to the point where they created all this devil doctrine to try and get back and get even with the so-called white man. Some Israelite experienced what I experienced yesterday, and rather than, working righteousness and staying in character and understanding that there's bad of all nations and that there'll be judgment for the wicked Gentiles who are rude to the Israelites, and that not every single Japhet type person is that way, they instead let that emotional anger consume them, and they go home and start making videos about, the Japhetic Neanderthal connection, or Esau is the red devil, Esau's the white man, he's the red devil who can't be saved, and, cave beast and monkey link and all this other type of stuff. So that's basically, one of the things I thought about yesterday is how anger turns into hatred, and hatred turns into false doctrine. You realize how, the Nation of Islam and the One West camps don't spend a lot of time talking about nations like the Filipinos, or, I don't know, even the Egyptians. Because the Egyptians, it's been, thousands of years since they were last oppressing us. And we don't really have any dealings with the Filipinos. You realize that all of the false doctrine and hate is directed towards the sons and daughters of Japhet, the people who have most actively caused harm to our people. So that anger is still flustering. And once again, anger turns into hatred, and hatred turns into false doctrine. So that was a very interesting experience for me yesterday. And it was something, I know some of the older Israelites on here might not, be surprised by this type of stuff. But for me, it was, because I didn't grow up in this part of the country. I come from very northern liberal parts of the country. That's where I grew up. And that only recently changed in like the last couple of months, where I started living near the South, not in the South, but near it. And this came up. So basically my message is keep your anger in check, because anger leads to false doctrine, it leads to hatred, and leads to unfairness. You know, a lot of us Israelites are frustrated, rightfully so, about how one Israelite is caught stealing at the Walmart in 2003, and now every Israelite in the country is viewed as a criminal. We're frustrated about that. But then it's very easy for us to let our emotions, turn us into monsters, and now we are viewing all of the J-fights as demons and accepting false doctrines of the One West camps and Elijah Muhammad and all that type of stuff because we're angry about what one of them did to us. So we need to remember that. And that's something, that was very educational for me yesterday, and just seeing how easily anger can turn to hatred, and then hatred is where false doctrine comes from most of the times. Now, sometimes, false doctrines because you just want to make money, like the Christian church. But in terms of One West and Elijah Muhammad, Nation of Islam, false doctrine, it stems from hatred, which you have to have anger first. So that's just my revelation, my 2 cents, that worldly anger is really useless and it doesn't really have much value. It's the righteous anger that we need to have, not this worldly anger. Bye for now.